My name is Emily, and I was 36 years old when Christmas dinner cracked something open that I had spent years holding together. I walked into my parents' dining room that night believing I could get through one quiet holiday, just one after rehearsing neutrality on the drive over, reminding myself to smile to eat, to leave early if I needed to. Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy. That lasted less than 10 minutes. We had barely settled into our seats when the conversation shifted the way it always did, casual and confident spoken as if a decision had already been made, without me in the room, and then the words landed clean and effortless like a line from a script. Everyone else already knew. Mom and Dad told me I could move into your place tomorrow. The table went still, not shocked expectant. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me, waiting for the nod, the pause, the familiar adjustment, the moment where I made it easier. I didn't raise my voice, didn't ask questions, didn't argue. I lifted my glass, took a slow sip, and let the silence stretch just long enough to matter. "Well," I said as I set it down. "Funny thing, the keys belong to someone else now." There was no explanation, no clarification, just the sound of forks resting against plates, and a realization settling in, uneven and uncomfortable, because that decision hadn't been made at the table, and what happened after that didn't unfold the way any of them expected. Before I tell you what happened next and why nothing could be undone after that night, let me ask you something. What time is it, where you're watching from right now, and where are you listening from? I always find it interesting how far stories like this travel once they're finally told. The room did not erupt after I spoke. It simply stalled like a clock that had lost its rhythm, but kept ticking anyway. The silence stretched longer than it should have, heavy without being dramatic, and no one rushed to fill it. Plates stayed where they were, glasses remained untouched, and the warmth that had hovered over the table only minutes earlier thinned into something cautious. My parents did not ask what I meant. They did not ask how or when. They waited. That familiar pause settled in the one that always came before I was expected to soften a statement I had already made. My mother's eyes flicked toward me, not sharply, not accusingly, but with that measured look she used when she believed a small adjustment would fix everything. She cleared her throat and said something gentle about timing, about how holidays weren't the best moment for misunderstandings. Her words shaped carefully so they sounded reasonable rather than corrective. My father leaned back in his chair and folded his hands, his expression unreadable, his silence carrying more authority than any question would have. He did not need details. He was waiting for compliance. Across the table, Lauren's confidence faltered in real time. The smile she had worn when she spoke drained away as she glanced first at our parents, then back at me, searching for reassurance she had assumed would be automatic. She tried to laugh it off, adding a light comment about how plans could always change, her voice rising just enough to signal uncertainty, but no one picked it up. The expectation in the room remained fixed in one direction. I felt it pressing in the unspoken belief that I would smooth things over, that I would clarify, explain, or retreat. My mother tried again, this time with concern, framed as advice, suggesting we talk about logistics later, suggesting I might be overwhelmed, suggesting there had simply been a miscommunication. Each suggestion landed gently but pointed toward the same outcome. My father shifted forward slightly, not interrupting, not correcting her, just reinforcing the sense that the matter was still open because he had not acknowledged it as closed. I stayed where I was, my hands resting on the edge of my plate, my voice absent. I did not defend myself. I did not repeat what I had said. The longer I remained quiet, the more unsettled the table became. Lauren's shoulders tightened as she realized no one was stepping in to restore the balance she expected. The conversation stumbled forward in fragments, comments about the food, about the weather, about nothing that mattered, each sentence landing awkwardly before fading out. No one mentioned the house again, but it hovered between us, present without being named. When dessert should have been served, my mother stood and began clearing plates instead, announcing that everyone must be tired. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as we stood, the evening ending earlier than planned, unresolved but no longer discussed. No one followed me to the door. No one asked me to stay. And no one said my name as I left. Later that night, the streetlights blurred past my windshield as I drove home, and the quiet felt heavier than the house I had just left. My phone lit up before I even reached the main road. The first message came from my mother, written carefully, every word softened before it reached the screen, asking if I had made it home safely, reminding me that everyone loved me, suggesting we could talk things through once emotions had settled. There was no question about what I meant, only the assumption that what I said was temporary. A few minutes later, another message appeared, this one shorter, more direct, asking what time would be best tomorrow to stop by, phrased like a detail that only needed confirmation. I didn't answer either. The phone rang shortly after, my father's name flashing across the dashboard. When I picked up, his voice was calm and measured, not curious, not concerned, but firm in the way he used when he believed a conversation had already reached its conclusion. He spoke about family responsibility, about how certain things were expected, about how it wasn't fair to make decisions that affected everyone without discussion. He didn't ask what had changed. He reminded me of what hadn't. I listened until he finished, said very little, and ended the call without agreeing to anything. By the time I got home, messages had begun to stack, suggestions disguised as plans, references to boxes, to dates, to how quickly things could be arranged if everyone cooperated. Over the next day, I saw the outline of a future being assembled without me. A spare room was discussed, furniture measured, logistics shared back and forth, as if the space already belonged to someone else. None of it came directly to me at first. It moved around me, carried by screenshots, forwarded messages, and casual updates meant to draw me back into the process. I watched from a distance, aware of how familiar that pattern felt, the way decisions gained momentum simply by being repeated often enough. I didn't step in to correct them. I didn't interrupt. My silence became its own message, though they seemed to interpret it as hesitation rather than refusal. Each hour that passed without a response appeared to increase their confidence that things would settle, that I would eventually answer, explain, adjust. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated quietly through unanswered texts, through follow-up calls I let ring, through reminders framed as help. What struck me most was not the persistence, but the certainty behind it, the belief that time itself would soften my position. By the end of the night, it was clear that no one thought the situation was final. They were waiting for the moment I would step back into place, convinced that everything could still be turned around if they just waited me out. The morning after Christmas arrived quietly, and for the first time in days, I was alone with my thoughts. Sitting at my kitchen table, I didn't drift back to childhood scenes or long explanations. I focused on a few moments that had always stood out because they never required interpretation. There was the year my living space was reduced to a corner so someone else could have more room, framed as temporary, but never reversed, and the way my hesitation was met with reminders about being flexible. There was the decision I made to take a job that worked for my schedule and finances, which was immediately weighed against someone else's convenience and quietly labeled impractical. Each time the outcome was the same, not because anyone argued loudly, but because my choice was treated as optional. When larger decisions came up, the pattern sharpened. Lauren's plans were discussed as needs that required support, while mine were described as preferences that could be adjusted. If she hesitated, time was created. If I hesitated, patience was requested. The difference was subtle enough to deny, but consistent enough to shape expectations. I learned early that the quickest way to keep things calm was to adapt, and the more often I did, the more natural it seemed to everyone else. Over time, that expectation hardened into a rule. Whenever I set a boundary, it was met with concern about my attitude rather than curiosity about my reasons. Whenever I said no, the response wasn't anger but disappointment, the kind that implies you've missed an unspoken agreement. I watched how the same family language shifted depending on who was speaking. With Lauren, reassurance came easily. With me, reassurance was conditional. It depended on my willingness to bend. None of this unfolded dramatically. There were no confrontations that demanded memory. It happened through small decisions repeated often enough to feel permanent. I realized that my reliability had become a resource others felt entitled to use, and my independence had been mistaken for availability. The more clearly I defined my limits, the more they were framed as selfish, as if wanting stability for myself required justification. That realization didn't hurt the way it once might have. It felt precise, like recognizing a pattern that had always been there. I understood then that the issue was never about space or timing or practicality. It was about who was expected to adjust and who was protected from having to. When I finished my coffee, I stood up, cleared the table, and returned to the present, aware that nothing I remembered changed what had already been set in motion, but everything I understood explained why it was necessary. A few weeks before Christmas, my calendar looked ordinary from the outside, but the quiet decisions were already underway. I had scheduled a meeting that morning not out of panic or impulse, but because I knew exactly how conversations in my family tended to end when they were left open. That was when I sat across from Daniel Harper for the first time in a small office that smelled faintly of paper and coffee, and explained what I needed without dressing it up. I didn't talk about feelings. I talked about control, timing, and permanence. He listened, asked questions that stayed practical, and outlined options that were clear enough to stand on their own. Over the next days, we moved through the steps carefully. Documents were reviewed, signatures placed, and contingencies addressed with the kind of precision that leaves little room for reinterpretation. Nothing about it felt dramatic. It felt deliberate. By the time the process was complete, the outcome no longer depended on anyone's approval. I didn't tell my family. That choice wasn't about secrecy for its own sake. It was about avoiding interference I could already predict. Every time I had shared plans in the past, they had been reshaped before they were finished, softened into compromises that suited everyone else. I wasn't willing to negotiate this one into something smaller. When Daniel confirmed that everything was finalized, he explained the implications, plainly the way professionals do when clarity matters more than reassurance. Ownership, access, and authority were no longer abstract concepts. They were defined. That was the point. When I later said that the keys belonged to someone else, it wasn't a figure of speech or a moment of provocation. It was a factual statement with legal weight behind it. I had chosen certainty over explanation, structure over reassurance. Protecting my decision didn't require permission, and it didn't require a warning period for people who would have tried to delay it. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, life continued as usual on the surface. I worked, ran errands, and answered routine messages without hinting at what had already been settled. The distance between what was known and what was assumed widened quietly, and I let it. There was a calm that came from knowing the groundwork had been laid before any pressure arrived. By the time the holiday approached, the matter was no longer open to discussion, even if others believed it was. I didn't rehearse explanations or prepare defenses. I understood that once something is secure, it doesn't need to be justified in advance. The decision existed on its own terms, complete and intact, long before it ever reached the table. 3 weeks later, the assumptions began to unravel quietly. At first, it showed up in the gaps between messages, the longer pauses where confidence used to sit. Plans that had been discussed with certainty stopped moving forward, then stalled completely. The date that had been circled for Lauren to move never materialized. The logistics that were supposed to fall into place did not, and explanations that once came easily started sounding uncertain. My parents reached out again this time, without the softness they had tried before. The tone shifted toward urgency, not anger, but something closer to concern, sharpened by inconvenience. They asked if we could talk, suggested that misunderstandings had dragged on long enough, implied that clarity was overdue. I replied briefly, confirming what was already true without adding context or reassurance. I did not explain the steps that had been taken or revisit the reasons behind them. Each response closed a door, rather than reopening one. As the days passed, it became clear that Lauren no longer had a backup plan waiting for her. The confidence she had carried after Christmas gave way to a kind of scrambling requests, turning into questions, questions turning into silence. The safety net she had assumed would hold did not. I watched the shift from a distance, aware of how often solutions had been built around my availability, and how unfamiliar it felt for them to confront limits that did not move. My parents tried again, calls coming at odd hours, messages framed around practicality and fairness, reminders of how things had always been handled. I answered when necessary, kept my replies short, and refused invitations to revisit decisions that were no longer open. The realization did not land all at once for them. It arrived in stages, through canceled arrangements, through confirmations that never came, through the growing understanding that my choice was not waiting to be adjusted. The authority they had once assumed over my decisions was gone, replaced by a boundary they could see but not cross. Lauren eventually reached out directly, her message lacking the certainty it once had, asking what options were left, as if the question itself might change the outcome. I did not provide alternatives. I did not offer suggestions. That responsibility had always belonged to her, even when it had been deferred. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer filled with expectation. It was filled with consequence. By the end of the third week, the family dynamic had shifted in a way that could not be undone. They understood then that my decision was not a phase or a tactic, and that there was no longer room to negotiate it into something familiar. What unsettled them most was not the loss of a plan, but the loss of influence. For the first time, they were facing a reality they could not reshape, and they were doing it without my participation. I remained where I was, steady and unchanged, aware that the space they could no longer enter had always been mine to protect. Once the reality could no longer be reshaped, the consequences began to surface in ordinary ways. Lauren had to confront the practical problem she had postponed, searching for somewhere to live without the cushion she believed was guaranteed. The conversations she had avoided now became unavoidable calls made with a different urgency, arrangements discussed without the confidence that someone else would absorb the fallout. I stayed out of it. I didn't monitor her progress or step in when delays turned into obstacles. The responsibility rested where it always should have. My parents faced their own reckoning. Promises they had made on my behalf came back to them, stripped of leverage, and the ease with which they once reassigned outcomes no longer existed. They discovered that reassurance offered to someone else carries weight only when the person expected to deliver it agrees. Without my participation, their assurances collapsed into apologies and explanations that went nowhere. The household rhythm changed subtly. Messages grew shorter, plans less specific. There were fewer assumptions and more gaps where certainty used to be. I noticed the shift without responding to it. I wasn't withholding out of spite. I simply wasn't available to rescue situations I hadn't created. The strain between them became visible in small adjustments rather than open conflict. Schedules conflicted. Expectations went unmet. Disappointment lingered without a clear target. Lauren's frustration surfaced in indirect ways, expressed through complaints about timing and fairness rather than requests for help. She had to negotiate on her own, something she had rarely done before. My parents tried to steady things by reframing the situation, reminding each other that circumstances change, that families adapt. But adaptation requires someone willing to bend, and I no longer was. They realized gradually and without ceremony that the role I had filled for years was no longer available. There was no argument to win and no decision to reverse. The absence of drama made the outcome harder to contest. I continued my routine unaffected by the urgency circulating elsewhere. The quiet was intentional. I did not attend meetings, weigh options, or offer solutions. When asked indirectly, I responded with neutrality, confirming nothing and promising nothing. The family dynamic adjusted around that absence, and in doing so, revealed how much had depended on it. Without a default fixer, unresolved issues accumulated. Tension spread not because of confrontation, but because accountability could no longer be redirected. My parents recognized that their influence over my choices had diminished to memory. The authority they once exercised now met a boundary that did not explain itself. Lauren recognized something else, that the safety net she relied on was not permanent, and that my steadiness was not an extension of her options. None of this required raised voices. It unfolded through missed deadlines, changed plans, and the steady realization that outcomes had to be earned rather than reassigned. By the time the pattern became undeniable, the damage was already done. Relationships thinned where convenience had once masked imbalance. Trust shifted not dramatically but definitively. I remained separate from the process not out of distance, but out of clarity. For the first time, the consequences of their choices stayed with them, and the family learned quietly and without ceremony that I was no longer the person who absorbed impact so others could avoid it. Sometime after everything had settled into its new shape, I made my boundaries explicit. The decision did not come from anger or exhaustion. It came from clarity. I reduced communication to what was necessary and defined what would no longer be discussed. I did not debate terms or invite opinions. I stated them plainly once and left them in place. There was no attempt to convince anyone that this was reasonable. I had learned that explanation only reopened doors I intended to keep closed. When messages arrived asking to revisit old ground, I did not respond. When calls came framed as concern, I let them go unanswered. Silence, when chosen, became a form of accuracy. My parents reacted not with confrontation but with distance. The frequency of contact dropped off until it disappeared into long gaps. There were no ultimatums and no apologies, only a retreat that suggested they were waiting for me to reconsider. I did not. Lauren's response was different but equally final. She stopped reaching out altogether, the absence of messages signaling a recognition that the dynamic she relied on was no longer available. The family ties I had known did not explode or collapse dramatically. They thinned. Conversations ended before they began. Traditions passed without coordination. Familiar routines lost their anchors. I accepted that loss without trying to replace it. What remained was quieter and more honest than what had existed before. Each person carried their own outcome. Lauren adjusted to a reality that required self-sufficiency rather than assumption, and the learning curve was hers alone. My parents confronted the limits of promises made on behalf of others and the cost of influence they no longer held. I did not step in to soften those lessons. There was nothing to rescue and nothing to negotiate. The separation clarified roles that had been blurred for years. I was no longer the intermediary, the buffer, or the solution. I did not offer closure conversations or final explanations. Those gestures would have suggested there was still something to resolve. There wasn't. What changed was not the absence of contact, but the absence of obligation. I moved forward without monitoring reactions or waiting for understanding to arrive. The distance held because it was designed to. Over time, the quiet proved durable. It made room for a life that did not revolve around anticipation or repair. I noticed how decisions felt lighter when they did not require consensus, how days moved forward without the weight of unspoken expectations. The long-term effects were uneven but clear. Relationships that depended on my availability dissolved. Responsibilities returned to their rightful owners. Influence shifted away from habit and toward consequence. None of this needed to be taught or announced. It revealed itself through consistency. The lesson was not something I delivered to anyone else. It was something I practiced. Boundaries worked because they were maintained, not because they were defended. Responsibility landed where it belonged because it was no longer displaced. I did not gain something dramatic from the separation. I gained something stable. The absence of chaos, the presence of choice, and the understanding that peace does not require participation in dynamics that erase you. I closed that chapter without ceremony and continued on, aware that what was lost could not be recovered, and what remained did not need permission to exist.